He had everything, the cars, the mansion, the power, but on one rainy morning his world stopped. When his dog ran into the street, a stranger threw herself into traffic to save it. A woman who owned nothing but had everything he'd lost. What started as a single act of courage would uncover the truth about love, compassion, and what it really means to be rich. Ethan Cole's penthouse was a fortress of glass and silence. From its towering windows, he could see the entire Manhattan skyline glittering, restless, and utterly under his control. To the world, he was the embodiment of success, the man who built empires from steel and ambition. But inside, there was only emptiness echoing through marble halls. His days were filled with deals, not laughter, his nights with numbers instead of dreams. The only sound that softened his world was the gentle padding of paws. Max, a golden Labrador with kind eyes, was Ethan's one constant companion. The dog had been a gift from his late parents before their tragic plane crash, the last reminder of warmth in a life consumed by ice. Max didn't care about money or headlines or power. He only cared that Ethan came home, and that simple devotion was something Ethan couldn't understand. Every morning followed the same ritual: coffee, emails, market reports, a quiet breakfast alone, then a brief walk with Max before the driver took him to the office. The sidewalks near Central Park were familiar territory filled with people Ethan never truly saw. He preferred it that way. Feelings were distractions, and distractions led to mistakes. His assistant, Amanda, once said he needed a hobby. "I have one," he replied flatly. "It's called making money." People laughed. But the truth behind the joke was darker. Success was the only thing that made him feel alive, and even that sensation was fading. Behind his cold demeanor, though, was a faint ache. Ethan couldn't name it, but it lingered every time he saw families in the park or couples walking hand in hand. He told himself it was envy of their freedom. In truth, it was loneliness clawing at his chest, something no wealth could silence. That morning, the sky was painted in gray. Clouds gathered like secrets about to break. Ethan buttoned his coat and clipped Max's leash. "Let's make this quick, boy," he muttered. Max wagged his tail, unconcerned with time or weather. Dogs had no interest in the tyranny of schedules. As they walked along Fifth Avenue, Ethan's phone buzzed relentlessly. A potential merger, a crisis at the firm, a journalist demanding comments. His voice turned sharp as he handled each call. To Max, his master's voice was thunder, but he stayed close, trusting him nonetheless. Then, in a single moment, everything changed. A street vendor dropped a tray, startling Max. The dog bolted, leash slipping from Ethan's gloved hand. "Max!" Ethan shouted, panic flooding his voice, a sound he hadn't made in years. The Labrador sprinted toward the street, where traffic roared like a river of steel. Ethan's heart pounded as he ran after him, helpless against the chaos. A car horn blared, brakes screeched, and he saw Max frozen in fear in the middle of the street. Before Ethan could reach him, a figure darted into traffic, a woman, coat flaring, arms outstretched, tires screamed. The world froze. And when it moved again, the dog was safe, but the woman lay on the wet asphalt, motionless. Ethan's breath caught. For the first time in his adult life, the billionaire felt something stronger than fear of loss. He felt powerless. Sometimes one moment changes everything, and one stranger can awaken what we thought was lost. If you believe kindness still has the power to change lives, join us, subscribe, and stay with this story. The journey's just beginning. Rain poured as chaos erupted around him. Cars halted, horns blared, and bystanders gasped. Ethan pushed through the crowd, his tailored suit clinging to him as he knelt beside the fallen woman. Max whimpered beside her, licking her hand as if begging her to wake up. "Call an ambulance." Ethan's voice cracked, more desperate than commanding. The woman stirred, her face pale but conscious. A thin line of blood traced her forehead. Her eyes, soft and amber, opened and locked onto his. "Is he okay?" she whispered, voice trembling. Ethan glanced at Max unharmed, wagging his tail, and nodded. "You're the one who's hurt," he said, but she smiled faintly. Then it was worth it. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Ethan insisted on riding with her, ignoring their protests. In the ambulance, he sat quietly watching as she winced in pain. Her clothes were soaked, her hands trembling. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she replied weakly. "Lila Thompson." Ethan wanted to thank her, but the words caught in his throat. Gratitude wasn't something he practiced. At the hospital, he handled everything. Private room, best doctors, all expenses covered. When Lila woke later, she found him standing by her bedside, phone in one hand, concern in his eyes. "You didn't have to do all this," she said softly. "I did," he replied, more to himself than to her. "You saved my dog." He pulled out a checkbook, his instinctive response to any debt. "Please," he said, scribbling quickly, "take this, for your trouble, for your bravery." But Lila shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Cole. I just did what anyone should do." Her tone was kind but firm. For Ethan, that refusal hit harder than any insult. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone with nothing to gain. "It's a lot of money," he insisted, as if generosity were a transaction. Lila smiled faintly. "Money doesn't fix everything." Her words lingered in the air like smoke refusing to fade. When Ethan left the hospital, rain had turned to mist. Max walked beside him, tail low, sensing his master's unease. For once, Ethan didn't take a call or check his schedule. He just walked, lost in thought. A woman had risked her life for his dog and wanted nothing in return. It didn't make sense. That night, he poured himself a drink and stared at the city lights from his penthouse. He had faced hostile takeovers, court battles, and financial crises, but none of them had shaken him like this. Lila Thompson's simple courage had left a mark he couldn't explain. As he watched Max sleeping peacefully by the window, Ethan muttered, "She saved you, buddy, but I think she saved something in me too." The dog's ear twitched in response, as if he understood. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel completely alone. Days passed, yet Lila's words kept echoing in Ethan's mind. Money doesn't fix everything. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not investors, not journalists, not even friends. He tried to focus on work, but something within him refused to quiet down. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was curiosity, maybe admiration. She had risked her life for a stranger's dog, and she hadn't wanted a single dollar in return. On the third day, Ethan called the hospital, only to learn Lila had already been discharged. That should have ended it, another loose end tied neatly. Yet, when he went to bed that night, he caught himself wondering where she lived, what kind of person she was, and why someone with so little carried so much dignity. The thought unsettled him. He didn't like not understanding people. The next morning, Ethan asked his assistant to look into her background. "Find out where she works," he said, his tone neutral but firm. When Amanda hesitated, he added, "It's not personal. I owe her a thank you." But deep down, he knew it wasn't just gratitude driving him. It was something he couldn't name yet. Within hours, the answer came. Lila Thompson worked as a volunteer at a small animal shelter on the edge of Brooklyn. That afternoon, Ethan found himself standing outside the shelter, feeling strangely nervous. The building was small, weathered, and painted with fading paw prints. Inside, he could hear barking, laughter, and the clatter of metal bowls, a symphony of chaos that somehow felt alive. For a moment, he almost turned back. This wasn't his world. His world was polished, predictable, sterile. But something about this place, or maybe about her, made him stay. When Lila saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mr. Cole," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "You didn't have to come." Ethan cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you, in person." Lila smiled, faint but warm. "You already did." He hesitated, unsure how to respond. For once, words failed him, and that silence spoke louder than any check ever could. Ethan stepped inside the shelter, and the first thing he noticed was the smell, a mix of wet fur, disinfectant, and something oddly comforting. It was far from the sterile perfection of his office, yet it felt real. Lila guided him through the rows of kennels, introducing him to dogs with names like Daisy, Bruno, and Lucky. "They all have stories," she said softly. "Some were abandoned, Some were hurt, but they still trust. Her words struck him like truth disguised as poetry. He watched as she kneeled to feed a trembling puppy, her voice gentle and calm. There was no pity in her actions, only quiet strength. Ethan realized that compassion wasn't weakness, it was power of a different kind. He'd built skyscrapers and shattered records, yet here was a woman building hope out of brokenness, and she did it without expecting anything in return. That was a kind of wealth he'd never known. When Lila offered him a chance to walk one of the dogs, he hesitated. "I don't usually," he began, but she handed him the leash anyway. The mutt, a shaggy mix named Oliver, tugged excitedly toward the door. Lila chuckled. "He likes you." Ethan wasn't sure whether to laugh or panic, but as he followed the dog outside, something inside him eased. Maybe this was what normal felt like. As the afternoon sun dipped low, Ethan found himself sitting on the shelter steps beside Lila. They didn't talk much, just watched the sky shift colors while Oliver dozed at their feet. For once, silence wasn't awkward. It was peaceful. Lila turned to him and said, "You don't have to come back, you know." Ethan met her gaze. "I know," he said quietly, "but I think I will." And in that simple exchange, a wall inside him began to crumble. When he returned to his penthouse that evening, the city lights felt different, softer somehow. Max greeted him at the door, tail wagging, and for the first time in years, Ethan knelt and hugged his dog tight. "She's something else, isn't she?" he whispered. Max barked as if agreeing. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, maybe money can't fix everything, but maybe people like her can." The following week, Ethan found himself returning to the shelter more often. At first, he told himself it was simply gratitude, an act of courtesy. But each visit lasted longer, and each conversation with Lila felt harder to walk away from. He began to notice the details, the way she laughed with the dogs, the light in her eyes when she spoke of hope, and the quiet sadness she carried when she thought no one was watching. It intrigued him in a way no business deal ever had. One morning he arrived early and found Lila painting one of the kennel walls. The brush strokes were uneven, her jeans dotted with splatters of blue and white. "You're really doing all this yourself?" he asked. She smiled without looking up. "Someone has to. The city doesn't fund kindness." Her words made him pause. He had built towers that touched the clouds, yet this small act of color on crumbling walls felt more meaningful than all of them. Without telling her, Ethan arranged for repairs to be made to the shelter. Overnight, electricians and painters transformed the space, fixing broken lights, leaky roofs, and fences. When Lila arrived the next day, she froze in shock. "You did this," she said, her voice trembling. Ethan tried to look casual. "It was nothing." But she shook her head, anger and gratitude mixing in her eyes. "You can't buy compassion, Mr. Cole. That's not how this works." Her reaction stunned him. No one had ever refused his generosity or questioned it, but Lila's defiance wasn't pride, it was principle. She wasn't angry at what he gave, but at why he gave it. Ethan left that day feeling exposed. For the first time, someone had looked past his fortune and seen the emptiness behind it. That realization was more unsettling than he cared to admit. That night, he sat by the window with Max beside him, watching the city shimmer below. "She doesn't want my money," he murmured. "Then what does she want?" The dog nudged his hand gently, as if to say the answer was simpler than he thought. Maybe, for once, it wasn't about giving, but learning to feel. Ethan began visiting the shelter not to give, but to help. He cleaned kennels, washed bowls, and even walked dogs, something unthinkable weeks before. Lila teased him gently, saying he looked more human when he smiled. He didn't know whether to be offended or grateful, but he smiled anyway. Slowly, the walls he had built between himself and the world began to crumble, piece by piece. Their conversations became deeper. Lila spoke of her childhood growing up in foster care, learning early that love wasn't guaranteed. She worked at the shelter because, as she put it, "I know what it feels like to be abandoned." Ethan listened quietly, her honesty disarming him. He had spent his life avoiding pain while she faced it head-on and turned it into compassion. For the first time, he wondered if strength wasn't control, but vulnerability. One rainy afternoon, Lila found Ethan sitting alone in the shelter's office, staring at his phone. "You okay?" she asked. He sighed. "I don't know how to be... this." She tilted her head. "Human?" she teased softly. He laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh that startled even him. It felt good. Strange, but good. That single moment shifted something deep within him, like a window opening after years of still air. As days turned into weeks, the tabloids caught on. Photos of the billionaire volunteering at a shelter flooded social media. Some called it charity work, others a PR stunt. Ethan didn't care. For once, the noise of the world didn't matter. What mattered was the way Lila smiled when he arrived, like she saw him, not the empire behind his name. Still, late at night, doubt crept in. He wasn't sure if he was becoming better or just desperate to feel alive again. Looking at Max asleep at his feet, Ethan whispered, "Maybe she's changing me. Or maybe she's just reminding me who I was supposed to be." Either way, for the first time in years, he didn't feel lost, just unfinished. Ethan's presence at the shelter became routine, a rhythm that surprised even him. He'd arrive in rolled-up sleeves, no entourage, no phone calls, just Max trotting happily beside him. The volunteers had grown used to seeing the billionaire who scooped dog food, though they never said it to his face. Lila, however, treated him the same as everyone else. She teased him when he messed up, praised him when he didn't, and every time she smiled, he felt a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. On one of those afternoons, Lila caught him staring at the old sign outside the shelter, its paint peeling, barely readable. "I've been saving for a new one," she said. "Takes time when you live on donations." Ethan hesitated, wanting to offer money, but he stopped himself. Instead, he said, "I could help repaint it." Her grin was immediate, genuine. "Then grab a brush, Mr. Cole." That simple act, paint under his nails, laughter in the air, felt more satisfying than any deal he'd ever closed. As they worked side by side, Lila told him about her dream of opening a chain of shelters across the country. "Not for profit," she said, "for purpose." Ethan admired that and envied it. He had spent his life chasing power while she chased meaning. That night, he lay awake replaying her words, realizing he didn't even know what his own purpose was anymore. Maybe it was time to find out. Their bond deepened, quiet but undeniable. Ethan began to see her not as someone who saved his dog, but as someone saving him. She challenged his beliefs without trying, healed parts of him without knowing. The man who once believed love was weakness now caught himself wondering what it would be like to hold her hand. But before he could understand what he was feeling, life and business began to catch up. One morning during a board meeting, Ethan's attention froze on a folder marked Urban Renewal Project, Phase 2. As he opened it, his heart stopped. The site map showed Brooklyn, and right in the middle, circled in red, was the animal shelter. His own company was about to destroy the only place that made him feel human again. For days, Ethan wrestled with the truth. He couldn't bring himself to tell Lila. How could he say that his empire, he was the reason her life's work was about to disappear? He tried to find another way to halt the project quietly. But stopping a multi-million-dollar deal wasn't simple. Investors were waiting, contracts were sealed. His silence became a ticking clock. At the shelter, Lila noticed his distraction. "You've been quiet," she said one afternoon, gently brushing dust off her hands. "Something wrong?" He forced a smile. "Just work things." She nodded but didn't believe him. Lila could read people, even those who spent years hiding behind glass towers. The more he avoided her eyes, the more certain she became that he was keeping something from her. Meanwhile, pressure mounted. Henry, his closest friend and business partner, pushed for progress. "It's the biggest redevelopment in the city," Henry insisted. "We'll make history." Ethan said nothing. He stared at the documents, feeling the walls closing in. For the first time, profit felt like poison. Every number on the page was a nail in something pure and good. One evening, Ethan arrived at the shelter after closing hours. The lights were off, but Lila was still there, sitting on the floor with a sick puppy in her lap. "He won't make it," she whispered, tears glinting under dim light. Without thinking, Ethan knelt beside her. He didn't speak. He just stayed. That night, something broke inside him. the illusion that money could fix everything. He wanted to tell her the truth, but fear won again. 2 days later, headlines broke. Cole Enterprises announces Brooklyn redevelopment project. The photos, the maps, the signatures all made it clear. The shelter's days were numbered. When Lila saw the news, her world stopped. Betrayal burned through her veins. She didn't need explanations. She only saw one truth: the man she trusted had sold her out. The shelter was chaos when Ethan arrived. Volunteers packed boxes, dogs barked anxiously, and Lila stood in the middle of it, all eyes red, hands trembling with anger. "You knew," she said when she saw him. No greeting, no hesitation, just truth slicing through silence. Ethan opened his mouth, but words failed him. "You knew they were going to destroy this place, and you said nothing." Her voice cracked, but her fury was ice. He tried to explain that he had discovered it too late, that he'd tried to stop it, but every word sounded like an excuse. "You had the power to save us," she said, "and you chose silence." Ethan's chest tightened. For the first time, he realized that money had not only failed to protect what mattered, it had destroyed it. Lila's disappointment hurt more than any loss he'd ever faced. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now held only sorrow. When he reached out, she stepped back. "You don't understand," she whispered. "This shelter, and it's not just animals, it's people like me, it's hope." Ethan felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt in boardrooms filled with sharks. He wanted to beg her forgiveness, but the look in her eyes told him it was too soon. She walked away, leaving him alone among empty cages and echoing barks that sounded like ghosts of what he'd ruined. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He sat on the curb outside the shelter as rain began to fall, his designer coat soaked, his world unraveling. For once, there were no calls, no assistance, no distractions, just guilt, cold and relentless. Max sat beside him, head resting on his knee, sensing his master's grief. Ethan whispered, "I don't deserve you, or her." The dog licked his hand gently, offering the kind of forgiveness humans rarely give. By morning, the headlines had turned brutal. "Billionaire destroys shelter, run by his alleged girlfriend." Photos of Ethan and Lila filled every newsfeed. The world that once adored his power now mocked his fall. And deep down, he knew he deserved every word. Not because he'd failed to act, but because he'd finally realized what real loss felt like. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's empire began to crack. Investors panicked, shares plummeted, and the board demanded his resignation. Henry confronted him in a cold, glass-walled office. "You've lost perspective, Ethan," he said. "All this over some woman and a few dogs." Ethan met his gaze, calm but tired. "Over something real, Henry. Something money can't replace." It was the first time he'd ever spoken from the heart in a meeting, and it cost him everything. By the end of the week, his name was removed from Cole Enterprises' tower. The empire he'd spent 2 decades building now belonged to people who didn't even know his favorite color. Stripped of title and influence, he stood in front of the mirrored windows one last time, seeing a man he barely recognized. Without the armor of success, Ethan looked human, and that terrified him as much as it freed him. He returned to his penthouse, but it no longer felt like home. The silence that once comforted him now screamed. He walked through each room, marble floors, empty dining tables, untouched wine glasses, and realized none of it mattered. Max followed closely, his soft eyes asking a silent question. Now what? Ethan knelt beside him and whispered, "Now, we start over." The next morning, he went to the shelter site. Bulldozers waited, but work hadn't begun yet. The air smelled of dust and memory. Ethan approached the foreman. "Stop the demolition," he ordered. "Effective immediately." The man hesitated. "But, sir, the paperwork." "Then I'll deal with the paperwork," Ethan said firmly. And just like that, the first act of redemption began not with money, but with a choice. That night, Ethan released a public statement announcing his departure from corporate life. He spoke not of failure, but of awakening. "We measure wealth by what we own," he wrote, "but true wealth is what we give and who we become." The words spread quickly, and while many doubted his sincerity, others began to listen. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole had nothing, and yet he finally felt rich. Ethan didn't waste time mourning what he had lost. Instead, he focused on what he could rebuild not in business but in purpose. He began liquidating assets, donating millions to animal rescues across the country. The media called it a desperate redemption campaign, but Ethan didn't care. For the first time, his actions weren't about image or legacy, they were about peace. He named his new foundation after Max, the Max Foundation for Forgotten Souls. The first project was obvious, rebuilding the shelter Lila had once run. But this time it would be bigger, safer, and sustainable, a home for both animals and people in need. Ethan visited the construction site daily, not as a boss, but as a worker. He carried supplies, planted trees, and cleaned cages. The volunteers were stunned yet inspired. Watching the billionaire's hands covered in dirt reminded them that change didn't require power, only will. Despite the progress, Lila remained distant. She had left the city after the scandal, and Ethan hadn't seen her in months. Every day he wondered if she knew what he was doing, or if she cared. Yet, he never tried to contact her. Maybe, he thought, redemption wasn't about being forgiven by her, but about becoming someone worthy of forgiveness. That thought became his quiet strength. The media eventually shifted from mocking him to admiring him. "The fallen giant who chose to build again," one headline read. But Ethan knew this wasn't about rebuilding his reputation, it was about rebuilding himself. Each hammer strike, each rescued animal, each smile from a volunteer chipped away the man he once was. What emerged was someone simpler, but infinitely more human. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ethan sat outside the new shelter with Max beside him. Children played with puppies nearby, their laughter echoing in the golden light. Ethan looked at the sign above the door, the Lila Thompson Shelter for Hope. His chest tightened, not with pride, but with peace. He had finally built something that mattered not to impress, but to heal. Months passed, and the Max Foundation grew beyond anything Ethan imagined. Shelters opened in 3 cities, each carrying Lila's name. He often wondered what she'd think if she saw them. Would she forgive him? Would she believe he had changed? Sometimes he caught himself rehearsing the words he'd say if they ever met again, only to laugh at the thought Lila didn't need words. She needed truth. Every morning, he began his day walking Max through the park instead of corporate hallways. People recognized him. Some thanked him, others stared. But he didn't mind. The man who once lived for admiration now found joy in anonymity. He smiled more easily, laughed more freely, and listened more deeply. Even Max seemed lighter, as if sensing his owner's healing heart. One afternoon, during a shelter opening in Chicago, a volunteer handed him a letter. It had no return address, just his name in looping handwriting he recognized instantly. Inside, a single sentence: "I'm glad you finally found what you were looking for." No signature was needed. Ethan stood frozen, the noise of the crowd fading around him. Lila knew. She had seen his journey from afar, and that simple message meant more than any forgiveness spoken aloud. That night, he reread the letter under the soft glow of his desk lamp. "What I was looking for," he whispered. It wasn't love, power, or redemption. It was connection. The kind he had once been too afraid to want. Tears stung his eyes, but this time he didn't hide them. Emotion wasn't weakness anymore. It was proof that he was alive. The next morning, Ethan announced a new phase for the foundation shelters that would offer therapy programs pairing rescued animals with orphaned children. "Love heals," he told the press, "and sometimes we find it in the places we least expect." The crowd applauded, but his gaze drifted skyward. Somewhere out there he knew Lila was smiling, and that was enough. The day of the grand opening for New York's new Max Foundation shelter arrived a sprawling space filled with life, light, and second chances. Reporters, volunteers, and families crowded the entrance as Ethan prepared to give a short speech. He was calm, almost serene, as if every wound from his past had found its place. Max sat proudly at his side, wearing a tiny blue bandana with the foundation's logo. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel like a billionaire or a symbol. He just felt present. As he stepped up to the podium, he caught a glimpse of someone at the back of the crowd, familiar, still, radiant. Lila. For a heartbeat, his breath caught, the world narrowing to that single moment. She hadn't changed much. Maybe her hair was a little longer, her expression softer, but her presence hit him like sunlight breaking through rain. Their eyes met, and the noise of the event faded into silence. Everything unsaid between them seemed to pass in that look. Ethan finished his speech without remembering a word of it. When the applause came, he barely heard it. Lila was gone from the crowd. Panic and hope tangled inside him as he stepped down from the stage, scanning the sea of faces. Then, near the kennels, he found her kneeling beside a rescued dog, smiling the same smile that once rebuilt his heart. He approached slowly, afraid that speaking too soon would break the spell. She looked up and said, "You finally did it." Her voice was calm, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. Ethan swallowed hard. "I couldn't have without you." She smiled faintly. "You would have. You just needed a reason." For a long moment, they stood in quiet understanding, two souls who had walked through fire and found each other again on the other side. Then Lila reached down to pet Max. "He looks happy," she said. Ethan nodded. "We both are." There were no grand confessions, no apologies rehearsed in sleepless nights, only peace. Sometimes love doesn't return as a storm. Sometimes it comes back as a calm sunrise that stays. After that day, Lila began helping with the foundation, at first as a consultant, later as a partner. Ethan offered her a position as director of outreach, but she accepted only after he promised it wasn't out of guilt. Working together again felt natural, as if their lives had been waiting for this rhythm. They traveled to shelters across the country, spreading a message of compassion and healing. Wherever they went, people saw something rare, two people who had been broken and rebuilt with love, not wealth. Ethan admired her strength every day. She didn't let his past define him, and he didn't let her kindness go unnoticed. Their connection deepened quietly without need for labels. One night after a long day of work, they sat on a bench outside the shelter, watching the stars. Lila rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You know, sometimes love isn't something we find. It's something that finds us when we're ready." He smiled, realizing she was right. It had found him the moment she stepped into that street for Max. Months turned into seasons, and their foundation grew into a movement. Ethan spoke at conferences about empathy and leadership, while Lila led projects that connected therapy dogs with children in foster care. Together, they turned pain into purpose. Their story began to inspire others, not as a fairy tale, but as proof that transformation is possible, even for those who've lost their way. Despite their growing success, Ethan and Lila kept their relationship private. They didn't need validation. Their happiness was quiet, sincere. On weekends, they would escape the city, walking Max along countryside trails. Sometimes Ethan would stop, watching her laugh, and think, "This is what I was chasing all along." He no longer measured his worth in numbers, but in moments like these, fleeting, genuine, irreplaceable. One evening, as they returned from a trip, Ethan handed Lila a small box. Inside was a simple silver pendant shaped like a paw print. "Not a ring," he said softly, "but a promise. For everything we still have to build." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then let's keep building." And as Max barked joyfully beside them, the world felt perfectly, beautifully full. A year later, the city gathered for the biggest event the Max Foundation had ever hosted, the inauguration of its 100th shelter. The air buzzed with celebration, but for Ethan, the moment felt quiet and deeply personal. As he stood on stage beside Lila, looking at the crowd of families, volunteers, and children holding rescued dogs, he realized something profound. His empire was no longer made of glass and steel, it was made of hearts that had healed one by one. When he began his speech, his voice trembled, not from nerves but emotion. "I once believed success meant never needing anyone," he said, glancing at Lila and Max. "But now I know true success is found in the people and creatures we choose to care for." The audience applauded softly, many wiping tears. Lila reached for his hand, and for a brief moment, the world felt perfectly still. It wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about gratitude. After the ceremony, Ethan and Lila walked through the park behind the shelter. Autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet, golden light filtering through the trees. Max trotted ahead, his tail wagging lazily. "You did it," Lila said, her tone proud but teasing. Ethan smiled. "We did it." They sat on a bench, silence stretching between them, not awkward, but full, like a song that didn't need words. Ethan turned to her and said quietly, "You know, I used to think love was something I didn't deserve, but now I think it was just something I didn't understand." Lila smiled softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "That's the thing about love," she whispered. "It doesn't care if you're ready, it just waits until you are." Max barked at a passing squirrel, breaking their trance, and they both laughed the kind of laugh that comes only from peace. As the sun dipped below the skyline, Ethan looked at the life he had built, not perfect but whole. The man who once measured everything in profit had finally found his wealth in purpose. He squeezed Lila's hand and whispered, "I used to think love was something you could lose, but now I know it's something you give." Max barked again, tail wagging, as if in agreement, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Cole truly felt home. In the end, he learned that love can't be bought, it has to be found and given. Sometimes a single act of kindness changes a life, or even saves one. If this story touched your heart, tell us what you felt in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this remind us what truly matters.